Hi, everybody. I'm filming these lectures for you from lovely Vienna, which you can kind of see in the background in my hotel room. And I apologize because the lighting here isn't the best. But from what I can see, it looks like it's good enough that you can see me okay. I'm going to divide this lecture into a few chunks to make manageable size videos, so it'll probably be more than two, but it will add up to 2 days worth of content. I'm also going to fold together talking about Malcolm X and Martin Luther King and kind of go back and forth between the two rather than giving you one lecture on one and one on the other. Before you watch these lectures, please make sure that you listen to the Malcolm X speech that I gave you the link to, which is one of this week's texts, the bullet or the ballot. And also please watch the really short Angela Davis video that I also posted a link to. I'd like you to have those in the background before you go on. Although I'm not going to get to the Angela Davis until towards the end, but it's helpful to see it before you start listening. I'm going to start with a moving passage, or at least I find it moving, from Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail. To me, this passage sounds remarkably current. So King writes, "When you have seen hate-filled policemen curse, brutalize, kick, and even kill your black brothers and sisters with impunity, when you see the vast majority of your 20 million Negro brothers smothering in an airtight cage of poverty in the midst of an affluent society, when you suddenly find your tongue twisted and your speech stammering as you seek to explain to your 6-year-old daughter why she cannot go to the public amusement park that has just been advertised on television." Okay, I'm going to stop there. I want you to notice two things about this passage before we dig into it. One is that even though we think of the civil rights movement as having been successful in many ways, this passage could have been written in 2019, right? These are still all racial issues that we are dealing with right now. The other thing to notice is that if you think through the passage, you'll notice that King is implicitly drawing on many of Iris Young's faces of oppression in order to talk about the barriers that Black people face in American society, right? He's moving between several of them. He's talking about violence, he's talking about exploitation, he's talking about cultural imperialism, and he's talking about marginalization at a minimum. So you should think through that for yourself and see how those all show up in the passage. So the question that both Martin Luther King and Malcolm X are asking is, if you have this kind of multiple axes of oppression going on, if you have a group that is subjugated to the dominant group in multiple ways, what is the best way to try to fight oppression? What is the best way to fight for justice? What kind of strategy makes sense if one group has way less power than the other and is oppressed along all these different lines? And Martin Luther King and Malcolm X articulated different, sometimes overlapping, but often different, very powerful visions that both focused on Black empowerment and trying to end racist oppression in the United States, and both shaped what anti-racist action has looked like since then. Both Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, as you probably know, were extremely important 1960s civil rights movement activists. These two texts that I've given you are from almost the same time. Malcolm X's speech is 1964. Martin Luther King wrote his letter from jail in 1962. Both were deeply religious. Malcolm X was a Muslim and Martin Luther King was a Christian minister, and both of them were assassinated. So there are a lot of parallels between their lives, but they are very different kinds of activists. Malcolm X, by the way, took X as his last name specifically to get rid of his slave name because at that point, and still really, the Anglo names that many Black Americans have came directly from being owned. So we actually get an initial clue that I'll wrap around back to. We get an initial clue to how Malcolm X thinks about resistance to racism and politics from this fact about him, that he took an independent name that wasn't tied to his ancestors' slave identity. So both Malcolm X and Martin Luther King ask some key questions that are on the table for both of them. Here's a few. What, if any, is the role for violence in resisting oppression and resisting racism? Is all good, proper resistance nonviolent, or is there a time when violence is appropriate? And also, is there a time when the threat of violence is appropriate, which, as we saw when we talked about Young, is not the same as violence? Another key question for both of them, perhaps the key question for both of them, is should our strategy be, as Malcolm X puts it, integration or segregation? That is to say, should Black people be fighting for entry into white communities and white institutions and white structures of power and trying to join those communities and integrate them? Or should Black people be building their own separate communities and finding ways of building independence from white America? Third question they're both asking is about negotiation. Right? How and when should Black people negotiate and compromise with white people, if at all, in the fight against racism? Another thing they're both interested in is the role of breaking laws, right? When is it appropriate as a form of political resistance to break laws? And here you get this especially in King. You can think of a kind of an opposition. On the one hand, you might, well, actually, let me make this as a separate point. So one thing they're both interested in is when, if ever, it's appropriate to break the law. Another related thing that they're interested in is when we're trying to, I feel weird saying we here because obviously I'm lecturing on this as a white outsider. So maybe I'll just stick to saying Black people, although I think that we should take the lessons of this as at least somewhat generalizing to fights against oppression in more broadly, although not totally, because different fights are different, as we saw when we talked about Young, right? Different groups face different kinds of oppression and different axes of oppression. So this is somewhat specific to fighting racial oppression, but has some larger lessons. Anyway, when Black people are fighting white supremacy and white oppression, should they try to appeal to a shared moral code, or should they condemn the moral code of the oppressors? In other words, do they ultimately want to say, listen, you are violating your own ultimate beliefs about what count as good principles and what counts as the proper way to treat people by oppressing us? Or do they want to say, you have built a set of laws and a set of moral principles that are wrong, that inherently oppress and exclude us? And those are very different strategies, right? To tell people that they're not living up to their own moral code is different from telling them that their moral code is wrong and corrupt. So there's an interesting question about which one we want to say to oppressors. So these are some key questions that come up in both Martin Luther King and in Malcolm X. And I think they agree with each other on some of these questions and they disagree on others. In thinking about how much they agree or disagree, I think it's really important to notice, and this sometimes gets ignored, that these two pieces are not speaking to the same audiences and that this might shape their message, right? We say different things to different groups when we are speaking strategically in order to try to motivate people and to bring about change. So Malcolm X is very specifically talking to other Black people who are interested in resisting. He's very much trying to inspire his own community. In fact, we are literally hearing him in the midst of talking to a huge crowd of Black activists, right? That's the audience for his speech. Martin Luther King is quite explicitly not doing that, right? He is talking to white fellow Christian leaders and white people who count themselves as allies in the fight against racism, but who have told him, oh, yes, we're on your side. We think racism is bad. We want to be allies, but we don't think you should be so strident. We think you should wait until the time is right and be more compromising and not, freak out white people by trying to do too much too fast. So he is addressing his speech specifically to white people and specifically to a particular kind of white person, namely a kind of white person who takes themselves to be on board with anti-racist causes, but is a little bit freaked out by Black resistance methods that are too in your face. Okay, digging into these issues, let's start by talking about Malcolm X on the segregation versus integration issue. Malcolm X comes down firmly on the side of segregation rather than integration, and this is probably the thing that is most distinctive about his political theoretical approach, right? The dilemma is, do we try to rebuild and reform the dominant culture to make it more inclusive? Or do we, and again here it's very hard to keep my pronouns correct, do Black people do that? Or do Black people aim instead to build a separate culture and make that culture strong and independent and make it not reliant on the dominant culture, and then maybe hope for reintegration in some new form down the road, but that's not the present goal. And Malcolm X comes down strongly on the side of the latter strategy, right? He does not want to try to rebuild or reshape current white dominant culture. Instead, he wants to build a separate Black culture that is independent and can function on its own. And this is the sense in which he counts himself as a Black nationalist, which is a phrase that he returns to again and again. Right? He counts himself as a Black nationalist freedom fighter. What's the sense of nationalist here? Nationalist in the sense that the nation or community that Black people build should be one to which they are loyal and which is its own thing, which is separate from the dominant white culture and white nation. So Malcolm X's central idea is that Black people, in fact, I'm going to go ahead and say Black men because we'll get back to that. He's not so great on gender inclusivity, right? He's mostly speaking to men, and that really shows up at a few times. He sometimes talks about the Black man, right? In any case, Black men should control the politics and the economics in their own community. This is really key, right? He thinks that in a system designed around white privilege, it is impossible for white people to be turned into benign rulers or to be talked into just giving their power away. Right? Once you already have that power, it doesn't have to do with whether you have evil intentions or anything like that. It's just in the structure of having power that a group that has power has, first of all, no good motivation for giving that power away. And second of all, will build institutions that are designed to reinforce and build up and reinscribe that power, right? So the idea is that because white people have more power, we already have a society with institutions in it that are structured so as to maintain white privilege. And so if what Black people are doing is trying to integrate themselves into those structures, then they are going to always end up relatively disempowered because those structures were not built for them. They were not built to include them. They were not built to make them equal. And white people have no motivation to change that, right? In Iris Young's terms, for example, right, once you have, let's just pick one of her faces, once you have institutions that are built on white cultural imperialism, that is, institutions that make white culture central and treat Black culture as deviant or unrespectable, we talk about respectability politics a lot, right? Then that's built into the institution. So if Black people are going to try to just get inclusion in that, they're always going to be coming in from the bottom and from the outside, right? So what does he want instead? He has a very strong emphasis, Malcolm X, on economics and economic independence, right? He's very pragmatic when it comes down to it. He thinks that the most important thing is that Black people own their own communities and control the economy of their own communities. More generally, he thinks that Black people need to build communities where they are in control of housing, education, businesses, and jobs, right? He wants Black people spending money locally in Black neighborhoods, and he wants that money to be spent building up Black businesses. He wants an education system that is not inducting Black children into a white culture that will never fully include them. And he wants Black people to control their own housing so that they don't end up in a relationship of exploitation, in Iris Young's sense, right, by being renters with white landlords. As he puts it, anytime you have to rely on your enemy for a job, you're in bad shape, right? In other words, no matter how good of a job Black people do at talking white people into hiring them or giving them homes or allowing their children into their schools, it's still going to be on the terms of white people. Right? And insofar as white people have power and control those institutions, that means that Black people will be continuously disadvantaged. So he says, no, the goal is not to get jobs in white institutions or to get access to white schools. The goal is to build our own jobs and our own schools. And the only way to do that is to have enough money of our own that we are in control of, that we have economic independence and we can do these things. Now, at the time, this was very radical. It's still kind of radical, right? But especially in the 1960s, the focus of much of the anti-racist rhetoric was specifically on the goal of integration, right? Integrating the schools, integrating the workplace. Integration was, relatively speaking, an unthreatening goal, right? The idea is we're going to end racism by bringing Black people into institutions that are already set up for white people. You know, the idea that a Black person would be pro-segregation at the time was quite bizarre, because the whole rhetoric was around, we want to end segregation. Segregation is bad, and we want to replace segregation with integration. But part of the point here is that integration at the time, and now too, didn't mean and couldn't really mean just blending the two together on equal terms, because things are set up for them to not be on equal terms, right? So integration meant leaving white institutions pretty much untouched and bringing Black people into them. It never meant, for example, the opposite. Integration as a political goal never meant bringing white people into Black institutions. It never meant getting white people to work for Black businesses. It never meant getting white people to go to Black-run schools. We almost didn't even notice that, right? That was such a deep assumption that integration was not symmetrical. Integration was about bringing Blackness into white culture rather than the reverse. But when you think about it, once it's framed that way, it's going to continue to be racist and oppressive. Right? So Malcolm X thinks that trying to gain entry into a community and a set of rules that is set up by those with power over you is just never going to bring equality, because the rules are literally stacked against you. And integration actually means letting white people control the terms of housing and education and economics and so on. I think that this is similar in spirit to Young's point about distributive justice. Remember, Young argued that if you treat justice as just a matter of dividing everything up equally and you don't change the background institutions, then you can give everybody an equal piece of the pie, but over time, inequality is going to reemerge and reassert itself because people aren't situated equally within those institutions, even if they temporarily get equal resources. Right? Similarly here, this isn't about equality of resources, this is more about equality of access, but Malcolm X's point is similar. If you give Black people access to these institutions, it doesn't change the institutions, and the inequality will reemerge. So instead, what he wants to do is create a subcommunity that's just not structured on those terms and exercise power within this community and make it strong. Right? So his focus is on economic independence and keeping money in the community rather than giving it to others to use against you. And also he focuses on having people in the community own businesses rather than work as wage laborers for somebody else. There's an interesting point he makes along the way, which he just kind of tosses off, but which turns out to be empirically really true and quite depressing. He says, we don't want to move into white communities because any white community that we move into is just going to turn into a black community anyhow. What does he mean by that? Right? His point is that, in fact, if black people move into a white community, white people will leave because the community will be devalued. And this is another version of the Iris Young point, right? That it can look like equal access, but in fact, because the institutions are already racist, it isn't. Now, it turns out that he's right about this. There's good geographic evidence that once a neighborhood becomes more than 10 or 15% black, it tends to fairly quickly become overwhelmingly black. In other words, 10 to 15% is about the level of blackness that non-black people, particularly white people, can tolerate before they feel that their neighborhood is now a problem and they need to leave. And so there's a tipping point. If there are enough black people in the neighborhood, it will just become a black neighborhood. And the tipping point is about 10 to 15%. This has been shown repeatedly by empirical modeling. It's a pretty strong indictment of the possibility of equality without changing institutions. Okay, so where does Martin Luther King stand on this segregation versus integration issue? I don't think he has nearly so stark an answer as Malcolm X does. I think that there are elements of segregationism in his thought and elements of integrationism in his thought. One segregationist impulse in him for sure, which is, he's less explicit about fighting for segregation for sure than Malcolm X is, and in some ways he disagrees with him. But here's a segregationist impulse in him. He is very explicitly in this essay arguing against waiting for the toleration of white people, against waiting until they are ready for change. He agrees with Malcolm X that as long as they have power, they have no motive to ever be ready. That people don't just give up the power they have for fun, even if on particular occasions they may set themselves up as allies and be generous. Being generous or kind isn't the same as being actually willing to divest yourself of your privilege and your power. So Martin Luther King agrees with Malcolm X that waiting around for white people to just give their privilege away when they're good and ready is a non-starter. It's going to have to be forced somehow. So in that sense, he is also, like Malcolm X, against trying to just make it into white society on its own terms, because those terms will be disadvantageous. Okay, so what does he suggest instead? Martin Luther King's main strategy is civil disobedience. In other words, he wants to explicitly and pointedly disrupt white society by breaking its laws when he finds those laws to be unjust, so as to disrupt rather than just compromise with or wait on the good graces of the institutions that are going to need to be changed. And here we can come back to this dilemma that I talked about at the beginning. When you engage in civil disobedience, you can frame it in two different ways. Right? You can argue that we all share a moral code and a set of moral principles, but the oppressors are violating it, and hence we need to disobey them. Or you can argue that the code and laws themselves that the oppressors have instituted are unjust and build in disadvantage, and that's why they need to be disobeyed. I think Martin Luther King really argues for both of these at the same time on different levels. Right? So, he's a committed Christian, and he does believe that Christian fundamental values are universal and foundational and have a grip over everyone. But laws, on the other hand, laws are human institutions that are not the same as a fundamental moral code. We want our laws to track our moral codes, but they don't always, right? Actual human laws, he thinks, are often corrupt, and our current laws, current in 1962, but I think he would say the same now, are unjust and sometimes need to be broken. So on the one hand, he's arguing for a shared moral code at the level of fundamental Christian values that grips everybody, whether we know it or not. But on the other hand, he's arguing that the human legal code does not fully track that moral code, and that the human legal code is in many cases unjust and needs to be broken. As he puts it, everything Hitler did was legal. In other words, legality doesn't earn you morality. Right? So what are his techniques for breaking unjust laws? His big emphasis, Martin Luther King, is specifically on breaking laws in ways that were, on the one hand, nonviolent. This is incredibly important to him, right? He's deeply committed to nonviolent action. But on the other hand, even though they're nonviolent, they're supposed to be disruptive. They're designed to be inconvenient and to cause a problem for the dominant culture. So he's a fan of illegal sit-ins, illegal occupations of buildings and spaces, illegal marches, right, where the point is not to hurt anybody or to harm anybody, but rather to disrupt. There's an interesting connection here, I think, between Martin Luther King and Bell Hooks. Remember, Bell Hooks talks about how Black people's rage is treated as inherently disruptive and sort of scary and out of nowhere, and that's treated as obviously bad and a problem and to be suppressed, right? And she argues that Black people often talk as if it's not even in their own interests to allow themselves to have that rage, because that rage is disruptive and irrational and a problem. Martin Luther King is saying disruption can be good. Disruption is not necessarily just an irrational outburst. Sometimes disruption is what we need. Why do we need disruption? He thinks that disruption is the way in which we can force negotiation. We can make things tense, as he puts it, and we can bring things to a stop and make things inconvenient enough that people in power have to negotiate. Because again, if you just wait until they feel like it because they're ready to give up their privilege, they're not going to. And so here's a nice passage of his. He says, "You may well ask, why direct action? Why sit-ins and marches and so forth? Isn't negotiation a better path? You're exactly right in your call for negotiation. Indeed, this is the purpose of direct action. Nonviolent direct action seeks to create such a crisis and establish such a creative tension that a community that has consistently refused to negotiate is forced to confront the issue. It seeks to dramatize the issue so that it can no longer be ignored. I just referred to the creation of tension as a part of the work of the nonviolent resistor." Okay, so I'm going to break in just a moment. We'll go on to another lecture. But what I want to point out here is, on the one hand, you have Martin Luther King saying, okay, we're going to disrupt on purpose in order to force negotiations, because otherwise they're not going to happen. On the other hand, what is Malcolm X's response to that? He says, look, even if you force negotiations through disruption, that's not enough, because the people in power have too much power to be trustworthy negotiators. Right? What Martin Luther King is trying to do is, so they both agree that white people aren't going to negotiate and give up their power just for the fun of it. Martin Luther King says, okay, well, we're going to force them to negotiate. Malcolm X says the more radical thing, which is, why force them to negotiate? They won't negotiate in good faith, and they have all the power. I mean, if you think about it, this is me talking now, if you think about it, it's just sort of a basic point about negotiation, is that both sides have to have some form of power that they can bring to the table. Otherwise, the negotiation is all going to be to the advantage of the party in power, right? So Malcolm X's point is, even if you force negotiation, that negotiation isn't going to go well for Black people, because white people are coming into that negotiation with dramatically more power. So how would Black people possibly get a fair deal out of that negotiation? So he says, forget negotiation. The goal is not to compromise with the enemy and to try to get the best deal out of them we can, because the best deal we can get out of them is going to be terrible. Rather, forget negotiation altogether, forget compromise, forget trying to build that bridge. The goal instead is to build a new community with enough infrastructure and enough social and economic networks so that they can ditch the dominant culture and make their own thing. So in that sense, I started out this bit of the argument by saying Martin Luther King is not a straight integrationist because he doesn't want to just sort of wait around to enter white society on its own terms. But in this sense, Martin Luther King is more of an integrationist for sure than Malcolm X is, right? Because Malcolm X is not even interested in negotiations. Martin Luther King says, rather than creating an alternative community or waiting around for white people to give up their power, do this third thing, which is try to force the revision of the dominant culture by forcing it into a crisis point through disrupting it. Accept the cost of breaking the laws in order to demonstrate the injustice of those laws and to force those laws to change. But Malcolm X isn't buying it because he says, as long as you are on the bottom, once you force revision and negotiation, it's still not going to be to our advantage. Okay, I'm going to pause there and we'll continue in a separate lecture.